On June 9th, 2024, something happened that will change your life forever, but almost nobody noticed. A 50-year agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia quietly expired, and Saudi Arabia chose not to renew it. For half a century, this agreement was the foundation of American financial dominance. It was the reason the dollar became the world's reserve currency. The reason America could print unlimited money without consequences. The reason oil-producing nations accumulated trillions in U.S. Treasury bonds. And the reason the United States could run massive trade deficits while other countries couldn't. That agreement was called the petrodollar system, and it just died. Here's what most people don't understand. The dollar isn't backed by gold. That ended in 1971. It's not backed by the strength of the U.S. economy, which represents a shrinking share of global GDP every year. The dollar has been backed by oil. Every country needs oil. Every barrel of oil sold anywhere in the world, whether from Saudi Arabia to China or from Kuwait to India, had to be purchased in U.S. dollars. That created artificial demand for dollars that had nothing to do with American economic strength. Countries had to buy dollars not because they wanted American goods, but because they needed to buy oil. And that demand allowed America to borrow cheaply, spend infinitely, and dominate financially for 50 years. But that system just ended. Saudi Arabia announced it would accept payment for oil in yuan, euros, and other currencies. China has already conducted oil transactions with Saudi Arabia in yuan. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and 4 new members, are building alternative payment systems that bypass the dollar entirely. And within 5 years, possibly sooner, the majority of global oil transactions will happen in currencies other than the dollar. When that happens, the demand for dollars collapses. Treasury bonds become harder to sell. Interest rates spike. Inflation returns. The trade deficit becomes unsustainable. And America's standard of living falls by 30 to 50%. This isn't speculation. This is the inevitable consequence of losing the petrodollar. And the timeline has already started. Let me show you exactly how we got here, what the petrodollar system created, why it just ended, and what happens next as the world's most powerful financial arrangement unravels in real time. To understand what just died, you need to understand what the petrodollar system actually was and how it was created. The story starts in 1973 with an oil crisis that nearly destroyed the American economy. In October 1973, Arab oil-producing nations, led by Saudi Arabia, imposed an oil embargo against the United States in response to American support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadrupled almost overnight. Gas stations ran dry, lines stretched for miles. The economy fell into recession. Inflation spiked. It was a crisis that revealed a terrifying vulnerability. America's entire economy depended on oil, and the oil-producing nations had just demonstrated they could weaponize it. President Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, understood they needed to solve this permanently. They couldn't control Middle Eastern politics, and they couldn't reduce America's dependence on oil overnight. So they came up with something more clever. They would make oil-producing nations financially dependent on the United States. In 1974, Kissinger traveled to Saudi Arabia and negotiated an agreement that would reshape the global financial system for the next 50 years. The deal was simple. Saudi Arabia would sell all of its oil exclusively in US dollars. Every country that wanted to buy Saudi oil, which was most of the world, would have to obtain dollars first. In exchange, the United States would provide Saudi Arabia with military protection, advanced weapons, and political support. The US would defend the Saudi regime against external threats and internal uprisings, and Saudi Arabia would use its influence to ensure other OPEC nations also priced oil in dollars. The agreement was formalized in a series of secret meetings and diplomatic cables that remained classified for decades, but the effects were immediate and transformative. By 1975, all OPEC nations were pricing oil in dollars. This created what economists call artificial demand. Countries needed dollars not because they wanted American goods or valued American assets, but because they physically needed dollars to buy oil. Japan needed oil to run its factories, so Japan needed dollars. Germany needed oil to power its industry, so Germany needed dollars. Every developing nation needed oil for transportation and electricity, so every developing nation needed dollars. This wasn't optional. Oil powered the modern world, and oil only traded in dollars. The consequences for America were extraordinary. First, it meant that no matter how many dollars the Federal Reserve printed, there was always demand. Normal economics says that printing money causes inflation because you increase supply without increasing demand. But the petrodollar broke that rule. The Fed could print dollars, and those dollars would flow to oil-producing nations who would then need to do something with them. They couldn't eat dollars. They couldn't build houses out of dollars. So they invested those dollars back into the United States, primarily by buying treasury bonds. This is called petrodollar recycling. Saudi Arabia sells oil for dollars, then uses those dollars to buy U.S. government debt. That lending allows the U.S. government to run deficits without facing the consequences other countries face. Second, it meant America could run unlimited trade deficits. Normally, if a country imports more than it exports, it runs a trade deficit and its currency weakens. People are selling the currency to buy foreign goods, which reduces demand. But America was different. Even though the U.S. was importing more than it exported, even though dollars were flowing out of the country to pay for foreign goods, those dollars came back because foreign countries needed dollars to buy oil. The US could consume endlessly, import whatever it wanted, and the currency stayed strong because the world needed dollars for energy. This is the exorbitant privilege that economists talk about. America gets to live beyond its means because the world is forced to finance it. Third, it gave America unprecedented geopolitical power. Any country that wanted to trade oil had to participate in the dollar system. That meant they had to use American banks, clear transactions through American financial institutions, and hold assets in dollar-denominated instruments. This gave the US the ability to impose financial sanctions that really hurt. When America freezes a country out of the dollar system, it's not just blocking them from trading with the US, it's blocking them from buying energy on global markets. That's devastating. It's why sanctions on Iran, Russia, and Venezuela have been so effective. It's not that these countries can't produce goods or generate wealth. It's that they're blocked from the financial plumbing that allows them to buy oil and sell their products. For 50 years, this system worked flawlessly. Oil traded in dollars. Countries accumulated dollars to buy oil. Those dollars flowed back into US Treasury bonds. American interest rates stayed artificially low because there was always demand for US debt. The US government could borrow cheaply to fund anything it wanted. Defense spending, social programs, tax cuts, all financed by countries that had no choice but to lend to America because they needed dollars for oil. It was the greatest financial arrangement in history, and it just ended. The petrodollar didn't die by accident. It died because the conditions that created it 50 years ago no longer exist, and the cracks have been forming for over a decade. Understanding why it ended requires understanding how the world changed, and why Saudi Arabia finally walked away from the deal. Start with American energy independence. In 1974, when the petrodollar agreement was signed, the United States imported most of its oil. America was deeply dependent on Middle Eastern supply, which gave Saudi Arabia leverage. But the shale revolution changed everything. Fracking technology, perfected in the 2000s and expanded in the 2010s, turned America into the largest oil producer in the world. By 2018, the US was producing more oil than Saudi Arabia or Russia. By 2023, America was a net energy exporter. This fundamentally altered the relationship. Saudi Arabia could no longer threaten America with an oil embargo because America does not need Saudi oil anymore. The leverage that forced America to protect Saudi Arabia in exchange for dollar-denominated oil sales disappeared. And if America doesn't need Saudi oil, Saudi Arabia starts questioning why it's locked into an exclusive dollar arrangement that limits its customers. Then there's China. In 1974, China was irrelevant to global oil markets. The Chinese economy was closed, impoverished, and barely industrialized. Today, China is the world's largest oil importer. It buys more oil than the United States and the European Union, and China is Saudi Arabia's biggest customer. In 2016, China surpassed the United States as Saudi Arabia's top export destination. By 2023, China was buying over 1.7 million barrels per day from Saudi Arabia. That's about 25% of Saudi oil exports. When your biggest customer isn't America anymore, when it's China, the arrangement that forces you to denominate sales in dollars starts to feel like a constraint rather than a benefit. China recognized this leverage and pushed aggressively. In December 2022, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Saudi Arabia for a state visit. It was a massive diplomatic production, ceremonial welcome, high-level meetings, billions in investment deals, and Xi explicitly proposed that Saudi Arabia accept yuan for oil sales. He argued that China is Saudi Arabia's biggest customer, the yuan is stable and backed by the world's second largest economy, and trading in yuan would allow both countries to bypass American financial surveillance. For Saudi Arabia, this wasn't just about economics, it was about sovereignty. The dollar system means every transaction is visible to American intelligence agencies. Every payment clears through American banks. The US can see everything. Trading in yuan offers privacy and independence. The relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia also deteriorated significantly. In 2018, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS, ordered the assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. The killing was brutal, shocked the international community, and created a rift with Washington. American politicians called for sanctions. The Biden administration released intelligence reports implicating MBS directly. Biden called Saudi Arabia a pariah state. MBS was humiliated publicly, and he didn't forget. When you build a relationship on mutual benefit and one side publicly insults you, the relationship fractures. MBS started looking for alternatives. At the same time, American foreign policy shifted. The US began openly discussing a pivot to Asia and reducing involvement in the Middle East. Troop withdrawals from Iraq and Afghanistan signaled that America was deprioritizing the region. For Saudi Arabia, this raised a fundamental question. If America is reducing its military presence and focus, what exactly is the US offering in exchange for the petrodollar arrangement? The original deal was oil priced in dollars in exchange for American military protection. But if America is leaving the region and China is offering infrastructure investment, technology partnerships, and guaranteed demand for oil, why stay locked to the dollar? Energy transition added pressure. The global push toward renewable energy and electric vehicles threatens long-term oil demand. Saudi Arabia knows that oil won't be the dominant energy source forever. In 20 or 30 years, demand might be half what it is today. That means Saudi Arabia needs to diversify its economy now build non-oil industries, and invest the accumulated oil wealth into sustainable sectors. The petrodollar system locked Saudi Arabia into dollar-denominated assets, primarily U.S. Treasury bonds. But those bonds yield low returns, and the dollar's value is uncertain given massive U.S. debt. If Saudi Arabia wants to invest in Chinese infrastructure, African development, or Asian technology, it needs currency flexibility. The petrodollar system was a constraint. Then there's BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa formed an economic bloc in 2009. For years, it was mostly symbolic. But in 2023, BRICS expanded. Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates joined. Saudi Arabia was invited and is considering membership. BRICS nations represent 45% of the world's population and about 30% of global GDP. And they're explicitly building financial infrastructure to bypass the dollar. The new development bank, headquartered in Shanghai, lends in local currencies. BRICS nations have discussed creating a common currency backed by a basket of commodities, including gold. And they're building payment systems that connect their central banks directly, allowing trade without using dollars or clearing through American institutions. Russia's experience accelerated this. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the United States and Europe imposed devastating financial sanctions. Russia was cut off from the SWIFT international payment system. Russian central bank assets held in dollars and euros were frozen. Russian banks couldn't access Western financial markets. The message to every other country was clear. If you hold assets in dollars and use the dollar system, America can freeze you out whenever it wants. China watched, Saudi Arabia watched, India watched. And they all started building alternatives because relying entirely on a system controlled by a geopolitical rival is too risky. The weaponization of the dollar through sanctions convinced countries to diversify away from dollar dependence. All of these forces converged. American energy independence removed leverage. China became the biggest customer and offered alternatives. The U.S.-Saudi relationship soured. The Middle East deprioritization signaled declining American commitment. Energy transition created urgency to diversify. And BRICS provided institutional infrastructure for alternatives. On June 9th, 2024, the 50-year petrodollar agreement expired, and Saudi Arabia let it lapse. No renewal, no extension, no dramatic announcement. Just a quiet end to the arrangement that underpinned 50 years of American financial dominance. To understand what collapses when the petrodollar dies, you need to understand what it created. The petrodollar wasn't just an agreement about oil pricing. It was the foundation of an entire global financial architecture that gave America unprecedented power and wealth. That architecture is now crumbling, and the consequences will reshape everything. The petrodollar created artificial dollar demand on a scale never seen before. Every country in the world needs energy. Developing nations industrializing needed massive oil imports. Developed nations running factories and transportation networks needed continuous oil supply. And all of that oil traded exclusively in dollars. Economists estimate that the petrodollar created demand for an additional $2 to $3 trillion beyond what normal trade would require. That's $2 to $3 trillion that countries had to buy and hold, not because they wanted American goods or investments, but purely to facilitate energy purchases. This artificial demand had cascading effects. First, it allowed the Federal Reserve to print money without immediate inflation. Normal monetary theory says that increasing money supply relative to goods and services causes inflation. Too many dollars chasing too few goods. But the petrodollar broke that relationship. When the Fed printed dollars, those dollars didn't just circulate domestically. They flowed overseas to oil-producing nations. Those nations then recycled the dollars back into U.S. financial markets, buying treasury bonds, stocks, and real estate. The money supply increased, but demand increased alongside it because the world needed dollars for oil. This meant America could run expansionary monetary policy indefinitely. The Fed could lower interest rates, inject liquidity, and bail out financial institutions without the inflation that would destroy other currencies. Second, it allowed the U.S. government to borrow cheaply and infinitely. When Saudi Arabia sells oil for dollars, it accumulates massive dollar reserves, hundreds of billions annually. Those dollars need to be invested somewhere. You can't just hold cash because inflation erodes its value. So oil-producing nations bought U.S. Treasury bonds. This was petrodollar recycling. Oil revenues flowed back into U.S. government debt. The effect was that the U.S. government always had buyers for its bonds. No matter how much debt was issued, demand existed because oil exporters had dollars they needed to invest. This kept interest rates artificially low. If the U.S. had to rely only on domestic savings and normal international demand, interest rates would be much higher and debt levels would be constrained. The petrodollar removed that constraint. Third, it gave America the exorbitant privilege of running permanent trade deficits. A trade deficit means a country imports more than it exports. Money flows out to pay for imports. Normally, this weakens the currency because people are selling it to buy foreign currencies and foreign goods. But America's trade deficit never weakened the dollar because the dollars that flowed out for imports came back as countries bought dollars for oil. The U.S. could consume endlessly, import cheap goods from China, buy electronics from Japan, purchase luxury items from Europe. The trade deficit didn't matter because the world needed dollars. This allowed American living standards to rise beyond what domestic production supported. Americans consumed more than they produced, and the difference was financed by the rest of the world. Fourth, it created dollar hegemony in global finance. Because oil traded in dollars, international businesses adopted the dollar as the primary currency for trade. Even transactions that didn't involve oil, like a South Korean company buying goods from Brazil, were often denominated in dollars because both countries already held dollars for oil purchases. The dollar became the global unit of account. Contracts, loans, and investments worldwide were denominated in dollars. This created network effects. Everyone uses dollars because everyone else uses dollars, and that made the dollar the world's reserve currency. Central banks held dollars as reserves. Governments issued debt in dollars. Companies kept dollar accounts. About 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are in dollars. About 88% of foreign exchange transactions involve the dollar. That dominance stemmed from the petrodollar. Fifth, it gave America financial surveillance and sanction power. Because dollars clear through American banks and the Federal Reserve, the U.S. can see every major transaction in the global economy. When Iran sells goods to Turkey, if the transaction involves dollars, American intelligence sees it. When Russian oligarchs move money, if it's in dollars, American authorities can track it. This surveillance enabled sanctions that actually worked. Cutting a country off from the dollar system meant cutting them off from global trade because most trade happened in dollars. Sanctions on Iran prevented it from selling oil effectively because buyers couldn't pay in dollars and Iran couldn't use the proceeds. Sanctions on Russia froze hundreds of billions in assets and crashed the ruble. This wasn't possible before the petrodollar because countries could trade in multiple currencies. But when one currency dominates because of oil, controlling that currency means controlling trade. The petrodollar also shaped American foreign policy for 50 years. Maintaining the system required protecting oil-producing regions. That meant permanent military presence in the Middle East, carrier battle groups in the Persian Gulf, air bases in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, troop deployments in Iraq, the first Gulf War in 1991 to expel Iraq from Kuwait, the Iraq War in 2003, the broader war on terror. All of these had multiple motivations, but a consistent thread was maintaining stability in oil-producing regions to preserve the petrodollar system. American foreign policy became oriented around ensuring oil flowed and traded in dollars. Regimes that threatened this system, like Saddam Hussein, who proposed selling Iraqi oil in euros, or Muammar Gaddafi, who discussed an African gold dinar for oil sales, faced American military action. For 50 years, this system enriched America beyond measure. The ability to print the reserve currency meant the U.S. could borrow at near zero real rates. The government borrowed and spent on infrastructure, defense, social programs, all financed by foreigners who had no choice but to lend. American consumers enjoyed low prices on imports because the strong dollar made foreign goods cheap. American corporations dominated globally because they operated in the reserve currency and faced no exchange rate risk in most markets. Wall Street banks profited from intermediating global finance because everything cleared through dollars. It was the most favorable financial arrangement any nation has ever enjoyed, and it was built on a single 50-year agreement with Saudi Arabia. That agreement just ended, and everything built on it starts collapsing now. The petrodollar didn't die with a dramatic announcement or a market crash. It died quietly, with an expired agreement and new oil contracts denominated in yuan. But the effects, once they fully manifest, will be catastrophic for American living standards. Let me walk you through what happens first. In the next 12 to 24 months, as the world adjusts to a reality where oil no longer requires dollars, the most immediate effect is on dollar demand. For 50 years, countries bought and held dollars specifically to purchase oil. Oil importers needed dollar reserves. Estimates suggest that the petrodollar created demand for $2 to $3 trillion that wouldn't otherwise exist. When oil can be purchased in yuan, euros, or rubles, that demand disappears. Countries that previously held massive dollar reserves will slowly reduce them. China holds over $3 trillion in foreign reserves, much of it in dollars. If China can buy oil from Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Iran in yuan, it doesn't need those dollar reserves. It will shift into yuan, gold, or other assets. Japan, South Korea, India, all major oil importers will do the same. This represents a slow-motion dump of dollar assets. When demand for dollars falls, the exchange rate adjusts. The dollar weakens. This isn't a sudden crash. It's a gradual decline over years, but the direction is clear. Estimates suggest the dollar could lose 20 to 30% of its value against major currencies over the next 5 to 10 years as petrodollar demand unwinds. That sounds abstract until you realize what it means for your life. A weaker dollar means imports cost more, the iPhone assembled in China costs more, the car with parts from Mexico costs more, the clothes made in Vietnam cost more, the electronics from Taiwan cost more. America imports about $3.1 trillion of goods annually. A 25% weaker dollar means those imports effectively cost 25% more. That's $775 billion in additional costs passed to consumers and businesses. That shows up as inflation. Inflation from a weaker dollar is different from inflation caused by money printing. You can't solve it by raising interest rates because the problem isn't too much money domestically. The problem is that the dollar buys less internationally. Your dollars are worth less relative to other currencies. The Federal Reserve can raise rates to slow domestic demand, but that doesn't change the fact that foreign goods cost more. So Americans face stagflation, rising prices combined with slow economic growth, because the Fed's tools don't address currency devaluation. The next immediate effect is on Treasury bonds. For 50 years, oil exporting nations recycled petrodollars into U.S. government debt. Saudi Arabia alone holds over $135 billion in Treasury securities. The Gulf states collectively hold hundreds of billions. Russia held over $100 billion before sanctions. These were automatic buyers. Oil revenues came in, dollars accumulated, and those dollars bought treasuries. When Saudi Arabia and other oil exporters can sell oil in other currencies, they accumulate yuan, euros, and alternative currencies. Those currencies buy Chinese bonds, European bonds, or other assets. The automatic bid for U.S. treasuries disappears. This matters because the U.S. government borrows about $2 trillion per year. It needs to find buyers for that debt. If traditional buyers, like oil exporters, step back, someone else needs to fill the gap. Either domestic buyers, which means Americans save more and consume less, or the Federal Reserve buys the bonds by printing money, which causes inflation. There's no scenario where losing major treasury buyers does not result in either higher interest rates to attract new buyers or inflation from central bank purchases. Higher rates mean increased government interest costs. The U.S. already pays over $1 trillion per year in interest on the national debt. If rates rise even 1 percentage point because foreign demand drops, that's another $1 trillion in annual interest costs. The budget deficit explodes, requiring more borrowing, which pushes rates higher, creating a vicious cycle. Oil price volatility increases. Under the petrodollar, Saudi Arabia had strong incentives to keep prices stable. Extreme price swings destabilized the dollar, and since Saudi Arabia held dollar assets, instability hurt them. But when Saudi oil trades in multiple currencies, that incentive weakens. Saudi Arabia might prefer higher prices in yuan, even if it causes dollar volatility, because they're diversifying away from the dollar anyway. Russia and Iran, both under U.S. sanctions and eager to undermine dollar dominance, actively prefer price volatility that hurts American consumers. OPEC's unity, always fragile, breaks down further when members are paid in different currencies and have different incentives. The result is oil price swings, from $60 to $120 and back. Each swing ripples through the economy. High prices cause recessions. Low prices hurt energy producers and cause layoffs. Stability, which the petrodollar helped maintain, vanishes. Geopolitically, American influence in the Middle East collapses. For 50 years, Saudi Arabia and Gulf states aligned with the United States because they needed American military protection and access to dollar financial markets. But if they're selling oil to China and yuan and diversifying reserves into non-dollar assets, why align with Washington? China becomes a more important partner. China buys their oil. China invests in their infrastructure. China doesn't lecture them on human rights. The alignment shifts. Saudi Arabia already restored diplomatic relations with Iran in 2023, brokered by China, something that would have been unthinkable when dependent on American security guarantees. As the petrodollar fades, Gulf states act more independently, sometimes in ways that conflict with American interests. Military costs increase. The United States maintains military bases and forces in the Middle East, partly to protect oil supplies and sea lanes. In 2024, the U.S. still has about 40,000 troops deployed across the region. Maintaining that costs over $50 billion annually. But if oil no longer trades exclusively in dollars and Gulf states no longer align closely with Washington, what's the purpose? Political pressure to withdraw increases. But withdrawal means losing strategic presence in a critical region. China fills the vacuum. The U.S. faces a dilemma: pay escalating costs for diminishing influence, or withdraw and cede the region to rivals. These immediate effects begin showing up in 2024 and 2025. The dollar weakens gradually. Inflation ticks upward. Treasury auctions see weaker demand and higher yields. Oil prices become more volatile. Middle East allies drift toward China. Each effect individually seems manageable, but they compound. Weaker dollar plus higher rates plus inflation plus oil volatility equals an economic environment Americans haven't experienced since the 1970s. Stagflation returns. Growth stagnates while prices rise. Living standards decline. And this is just the beginning. The immediate effects in the first year or two. The medium-term effects are far worse. What happens over the next 5 to 10 years as the petrodollar's death fully reverberates through the global economy is the unraveling of dollar reserve status. This is the real catastrophe. Reserve currency status has been the foundation of American prosperity for 80 years. Losing it doesn't happen overnight, but once the process starts, it accelerates. And the petrodollar's end is the catalyst. Reserve currency means that central banks around the world hold that currency as a primary asset. About 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are in dollars. That's roughly $7 trillion held by foreign central banks, not for trade or transactions, but as savings. Why do they hold dollars? Historically, 3 reasons. First, the dollar was needed for oil transactions because of the petrodollar. Second, the dollar was stable and backed by the largest economy. Third, U.S. Treasury bonds offered a liquid, safe place to park reserves. The first reason just disappeared. The second is eroding as China's economy rivals America's and U.S. debt reaches dangerous levels. The third weakens as Treasury yields stay low while inflation erodes returns. When central banks start questioning why they hold 60% of reserves in dollars, they diversify. This isn't dramatic. Central banks don't dump assets. They slowly shift new purchases. Instead of buying treasuries with new reserves, they buy euros, yuan, gold, or other assets. But over years, this adds up. If global reserves shift from 60% dollars to 40% over a decade, that's about $2.3 trillion exiting dollar assets. That selling pressure pushes the dollar down further, which makes other central banks want to reduce exposure, which accelerates the decline. It becomes self-reinforcing. China actively encourages this through the Belt and Road Initiative. China lends to developing countries in yuan. Those countries use yuan to buy Chinese goods and repay loans. This creates a yuan ecosystem in Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America. Countries participating in Belt and Road need yuan reserves, not dollar reserves. As this ecosystem grows, the dollar's share of global reserves shrinks. By 2030, estimates suggest the yuan could represent 20 to 25% of global reserves, up from about 3% today. That growth comes primarily at the dollar's expense. The euro also gains share. The European Union is the world's largest single market. The euro is already the second most held reserve currency at about 20%. As the dollar weakens and dollar-based financial system looks less reliable, central banks increase euro holdings. Europeans actively promote this by issuing more euro-denominated bonds and expanding euro payment systems. By 2035, the euro could be 30% of reserves. Gold resurges as a reserve asset. Central banks, especially Russia and China, have been accumulating gold aggressively. Russia increased gold reserves from 700 tons in 2010 to over 2,000 tons by 2023. China officially holds about 2,000 tons, but likely has more in undisclosed reserves. Gold represents about 15% of global reserves now. As fiat currency trust erodes, that could rise to 25%. Gold purchases mean selling dollars to buy gold, further reducing dollar demand. As the dollar's share of reserves falls, its privileges disappear. The U.S. government loses the ability to borrow cheaply. Interest rates rise to attract buyers. Deficits become unsustainable. The government faces a choice: cut spending dramatically, raise taxes, or print money and accept high inflation. Each option is politically toxic and economically painful. Cut spending and government services collapse. Raise taxes and the economy contracts. Print money and inflation destroys savings. There's no good option. Trade deficits become unsustainable. For 50 years, America ran trade deficits because foreign countries needed dollars. The deficit was how dollars entered global circulation. But when the world doesn't need dollars, deficits mean currency weakness. The dollar falls, imports become expensive, American consumers can't afford foreign goods, and living standards drop. The U.S. might be forced into trade balance, or even surpluses, meaning Americans consume less and export more. That's a wrenching adjustment. American consumption is 68% of GDP. Reducing that by 10 or 15% to balance trade means a severe recession or worse. American companies lose competitive advantages. For decades, U.S. corporations operated in the reserve currency. They face no currency risk in most markets. They could borrow cheaply in dollars and invest globally. But as the dollar loses reserve status, that advantage disappears. European and Chinese companies can borrow in euros or yuan at similar rates. American companies face currency risk when operating abroad. Profits earned in foreign currencies lose value when converted to dollars if the dollar is weak, but operating costs in dollars are fixed. This squeeze on profitability leads to layoffs, reduced investment, and declining stock prices. The financial sector, Wall Street banks, asset managers, insurance companies thrived on dollar dominance. Global finance cleared through New York. Trade settled in dollars. Wall Street banks took fees at every step. As the dollar's role shrinks, financial activity migrates. Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Frankfurt gain share. New York's dominance fades. The financial sector, which employs millions and generates trillions in economic activity, contracts. This isn't just about banker bonuses. It's about support jobs, tax revenues, and economic dynamism. Geopolitically, America loses the ability to enforce sanctions effectively. Sanctions work because the world needed dollars. Cut a country out of the dollar system, and they couldn't trade. But if significant trade happens in yuan, euros, and other currencies, dollar sanctions lose bite. Iran and Russia, both under heavy sanctions, pivot to yuan-based trade with China and other non-Western countries. They survive and even thrive despite American efforts to isolate them. Other countries see this and realize American sanctions can be circumvented. U.S. geopolitical leverage declines. Military spending becomes constrained. For decades, America spent more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. That was affordable because the government could borrow cheaply and the economy was wealthy. But as reserve status fades, borrowing costs rise and the economy shrinks relative to global GDP. Defense spending as a percentage of GDP stays around 3%, but the actual purchasing power declines. Meanwhile, China's defense spending increases. By 2035, China could match or exceed U.S. military spending. American force projection capabilities decline. Overseas bases close. Carrier battle groups reduce. The military pulls back from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East because it's unaffordable. Regional powers fill the vacuum. This medium-term period, from 2025 to 2035, is when the full reality of lost reserve status hits. Americans experience it as persistently high inflation, slow growth, declining wages relative to costs, crumbling infrastructure because government can't fund repairs, reduced public services, and a general sense that the country is in decline. Politically, this breeds extremism. Populists on both left and right gain power by promising to restore greatness or redistribute remaining wealth. Political stability becomes uncertain. The combination of economic decline and political instability creates a national crisis comparable to the Great Depression or the 1970s stagflation, but longer lasting. By 2040, the world looks fundamentally different. The petrodollar is a historical memory. Dollar dominance is over, and a new multipolar financial order has emerged. Let me describe what that world looks like and what it means for America and the average American. The dollar still exists and is still important, but it's one currency among several. The yuan is the dominant currency in Asia, used for roughly 40% of trade in the region. The euro dominates Europe and has expanded influence in Africa through European investment and aid. The dollar remains significant in the Americas, but represents only about 30% of global reserves and 40% of global trade, down from 88% in 2024. Gold and digital assets, potentially including central bank digital currencies, represent about 20% of reserves. The dollar's fall from dominance to parity with other currencies represents the biggest shift in global finance since World War II. Trade patterns have shifted. The United States no longer runs massive trade deficits. The deficit peaked around 2025 and declined thereafter as a weaker dollar made American goods more competitive and imports more expensive. By 2040, trade is roughly balanced, but this came through reduced consumption, not increased production. Americans buy less because they're poorer in global terms. Living standards are perhaps 30 to 40% lower than they were in 2020. This does not mean abject poverty. It means less discretionary spending, smaller homes, older cars, fewer luxuries, and more domestic goods instead of imports. Manufacturing is partially returned. As imports became expensive due to currency weakness, domestic production became competitive again. Factories reopened in the Midwest and South. But these aren't the well-paying union jobs of the 1960s. They're lower wage positions because America is now a cheaper labor market compared to the past. The American worker's standard of living has converged downward toward global averages. This is painful and politically volatile. Government services have contracted. Federal debt reached 150% of GDP in the 2030s as rising interest costs and declining revenues created a fiscal crisis. The government was forced to make cuts. Social security benefits were reduced. Medicare eligibility was raised. Infrastructure spending was slashed. Education funding declined. The federal government does less, and states and localities try to fill gaps with varying success. Public services in wealthy areas remain decent. In poor areas, they collapse. China is the dominant economic power. Its Belt and Road Initiative connected dozens of countries into a WAN-based trading system. Chinese technology companies dominate globally. Chinese infrastructure firms build projects worldwide. China's military rivals, America's, and China's geopolitical influence has expanded into regions America once dominated. The South China Sea is effectively Chinese territory. Taiwan has reunified with the mainland, either through diplomacy or force because America lacked the will and resources to intervene. The Indo-Pacific is China's sphere of influence. Europe has asserted independence. Without relying on American security guarantees and financial systems, European nations built their own defense capabilities and financial infrastructure. The euro-based payment systems rival SWIFT. European military forces, while smaller than America's, are sufficient for regional defense. Europe pursues its own foreign policy, often conflicting with American preferences. The transatlantic alliance is reduced to formal cooperation without deep integration. Russia has reasserted control over former Soviet territories, with America distracted by domestic economic problems and unable to project power effectively. Russia faced little resistance in expanding influence over Central Asia and parts of Eastern Europe. Belarus is fully integrated. Ukraine is neutral or pro-Russian. The Caucasus and Central Asian states are in Russia's orbit. The Middle East is multipolar. China is the dominant external power due to energy purchases and investment. Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia are regional powers pursuing their own interests without American interference. Israel remains, but is more isolated. The region is less stable than during American dominance, but no single power controls it. America is a regional power, still dominant in the Western Hemisphere, but with limited global reach. The Monroe Doctrine has been reasserted. American focus is on North and South America, ensuring no rival powers establish presence nearby. But beyond the Americas, American influence is marginal. This is a dramatic come down from the global hegemon of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. For the average American in 2040, life is harder. Incomes adjusted for purchasing power are lower. Retirement is less secure because Social Security and pensions lost value. Healthcare is more expensive and less accessible. Education costs more and delivers less. Infrastructure is crumbling because investment declined. The middle class has shrunk. Wealth inequality has increased as those who owned assets that appreciated weathered the transition while wage earners suffered. Politically, the country is divided and angry, cycling through leaders who promise solutions that never materialize. Because the fundamental problem is structural decline, and reversing it requires decades of painful adjustment. This is what happens when the petrodollar dies. Not overnight collapse, but gradual, grinding decline over 15 to 20 years. The 2020s and 2030s is a period of American diminishment comparable to Britain's decline after World War II. The difference is that Britain transitioned from empire to comfortable middle power over decades, with allies managing the process. America faces faster decline with rivals eager to accelerate it. Could this be prevented? Theoretically, yes. America could aggressively reduce debt, reform entitlements, rebuild manufacturing, invest in infrastructure and education, balance the budget, and restore fiscal credibility. But that requires political will that doesn't exist. It requires short-term sacrifice for long-term gain, and democracies struggle with that. Every reform gets blocked by interests that lose. Every budget cut faces opposition. Every tax increase is unpopular, so nothing happens. The decline continues. And 15 years from now, Americans look back at the 2020s as the moment when petrodollar death began the unraveling, and no one did anything to stop it. The petrodollar just died. The 50-year agreement that made America financially dominant has ended. Saudi Arabia is selling oil in WAN. BRICS nations are building alternative systems. And the cascade has started. Dollar demand falls. Treasury buyers disappear. Inflation rises. The currency weakens. Reserve status fades. American living standards decline. By 2040, the dollar is just another currency, and America is just another country. Wealthier than most, but no longer exceptional. No longer the indispensable nation. No longer the global hegemon. That transformation started on June 9th, 2024, when a 50-year agreement expired and wasn't renewed. Almost nobody noticed, but the consequences will define the rest of the century.